We saw an astounding story today from an FBI whistleblower over at Uncover DC. It got picked up at the Daily Wire, at National Review, at our site hotair.com, part of the Salem family, that claims the FBI has actually put Catholics who go to Latin Mass on a list of potential domestic terrorists. I'm not kidding. That's what the story claims, and there's actually a letter that suggests exactly that. Well, joining us right now, our official, unofficial Catholic correspondent, Ed Morrissey, the managing editor of hotair.com. I mean, you do go to Vatican City and report on the church, so you might as well be our Catholic correspondent. Thanks, Ed, for joining us.
It's a pleasure. And may I just start off by saying, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa.
Right. Oh, there you go. Now you're on the list. So just for our non-Catholic viewers, and for that matter, our uncatechized Catholic viewers, let's explain what we mean by the Latin Mass. It's not just our Mass that is just said in Latin instead of the vernacular. It's actually a different Mass altogether, right?
Well, it is. I mean, technically speaking, it's got the same elements as the vernacular Mass, right? The Novus Ordo, but the traditional Latin Mass, the Tridentine Mass, has its own characteristics. It's a very old form of the Mass.
Yeah.
It was used for centuries until Vatican II, and it's a matter of great controversy within the Catholic Church itself, which is actually, when I first started reading this, was thinking, did the Vatican leak this letter?
Right, exactly. Well, I had the same reaction as like, is Pope Francis working for the FBI? Because this has become an internal controversy within the church. And I want to get to that a little bit later. You're absolutely right. But the fact that the FBI has determined that proponents of the traditional Latin Mass here in America could very well be racist or potential domestic terrorists, that's disconcerting, isn't it? Why exactly are they making this case?
I mean, I suspect that they're making a case just because they're looking to get some work. It's not as though Christian sects have not arisen that are racist, that have been associated with violence. I mean, you have the Order, I think, is probably the most well-known of these. It's, the sort of these, militia type, Christian sects that have been around. Those are actual domestic terrorism threats, and the FBI tracks them, and there are good reasons for that. But the people who are backing the traditional Latin Mass are they're extreme in terms of their Catholicism, and they might be deeply politically conservative, but it doesn't necessarily relate to a domestic threat. I'm absolutely flummoxed by this effort, especially the idea that the FBI is now going to, and this is the best part of it for me, they're going to infiltrate the Latin Mass in order to find the extremists. Which ones are those? The ones who are kneeling?
Right, exactly. Just stand in the confession line, and I'm sure you'll find them. Listen, the red flag to me when I read this, Ed, was the fact that the source that the FBI was using was the Southern Poverty Law Center. I mean, these are people that say Alliance Defending Freedom is a hate group.
Right. I mean, the SPLC is really should be completely discredited as a source for this. Now, if the FBI had gotten some sort of insider tip among some, extreme Latin Mass, organization, Latin Mass backing organization, that there was an actual threat going on, then I could understand that. But this is just the SPLC trying to describe anybody that doesn't match up with their own ideas of progressive liberalism as extremists and hate groups. And I mean, it's almost absurd to cast the Catholic Church in this light, because the Catholic Church was one of the targets of the Ku Klux Klan in the South, which is where these guys are supposedly originating from, and they should know better than this.
Great point.
And
they're literally characterizing people who go to the traditional Latin Mass right alongside the Ku Klux Klan, which, I mean, it's absurd.
Yeah, there's not a lot of overlap. But I mean, I know that Kamala Harris likes Venn diagrams. Those really are two separate spheres. Those really don't have any overlap.
Oh,
whatsoever.
God, don't get her started on the Venn diagrams and the school buses. And one other aspect of this that I thought was interesting, they cited as one of the characteristics of somebody, a traditional Catholic who would go to the traditional Latin Mass, as being extremely pro-life. as if that was an indication that you might be a criminal. This is incredibly disconcerting for a government law enforcement agency to make these claims in a written document. And oh, by the way, not to mention the fact that religion is baked into this equation, because last I checked, First Amendment should protect people from attending whatever faith they want, even in Latin.
Right. And I think, and this really does raise a lot of broader questions. And it's not just the question, by the way, of Catholics. I mean, after 9/11, there were FBI agents that were infiltrating mosques. And I think that there were some legitimate reasons for that. And again, going back into the 1980s, you have FBI agents and their informers that were infiltrating, radical Christian sects like the Order. And I just keep bringing that up because that's the one that pops up to mind. In order to head off domestic terrorism. So I'm not going to say that that's a completely illegitimate strategy or tactic. But what I am going to say is that the conflict over the Latin Mass is not a domestic. It's not a domestic political issue.
Right.
It has to do with a conflict within the Catholic Church as to whether or not they're going to recognize the same type of mass that they recognized for centuries. Yeah. And that traditionally has been allowed to continue to go on. The problem in the Catholic Church is that Pope Francis has kind of seized on this as sort of a indicator of opposition to the Holy See and his own pontificate, which to extent that may not be an illegitimate complaint. And it's created a sort of radicalism among Catholics about Catholicism.
About Catholicism.
About Catholicism, right, yes.
If they're extreme in their views, it has nothing to do with the U.S. government. It has to do with the Vatican and the Holy See. Well, let's get to that. Let's take off Dr. Taylor Marshall and Patrick Coffin for a second. When the Pope puts restrictions on the use of the Latin Mass, as you said, he equates those adherents who are strictly saying that you must do the Latin Mass. They're putting, he's making a statement there, the Pope is, that there are some who believe that that's the only legitimate Mass, that if you go to the regular vernacular Novus Ordo, that it's not legitimate. And in fact, there are many people who sort of isolate themselves, create a private sectarian sort of group of Catholics that will even say that Pope Francis and his predecessors, going all the way back to the 60s, were not legitimate popes.
Right.
That is a problem that the church is trying to address, but it shouldn't happen. The FBI should have nothing to do with it.
The FBI shouldn't have anything to do with this. And I actually think that the Latin Mass really shouldn't have anything to do with this either. I mean, there are certainly sedevacantists, which is what they're called. The sedevacantists refers to the Latin. See, I'm already an extremist. I'm using Latin here. Right. It's sedevacante means open seat. And when a pope dies, in the interregnum between the pope dying and the next pope being selected in a conclave, it's called sedevacante. The period of an open seat is basically what this means. And there are people within the Catholic Church who claim that we have been in a sedevacante state since, John Paul the 23rd, I think, is the argument that's being made.
Right. Oh, I thought it went back to Paul VI or something.
Well, Paul VI was the first. Well, Paul VI. Yeah, I mean, I think.
Oh, John 23, not John Paul. You said John Paul.
Did I say
John
I
23?
Did say,
yeah.
John 23. Yeah, I'm sorry. I misspoke. John the 23rd, I think, is the last.
Exactly. And then Pope Paul was not the legitimate pope because guitars came into the Mass or something. I don't know. And then there's another group that thinks that we had legitimate popes up until Benedict, and then he didn't really resign, so Francis was illegitimate, and now we have an open seat because Benedict is dead. It's very confusing. But certainly shouldn't be subject to federal investigation, which is something that...
It doesn't have anything to do with an issue with the U.S. government or even with law and order here in the United States. The sedevacante conflict, the Society of, Pius XII, I think, of St. Is SSPX.
St. Pius X.
St. Pius X. Yeah, some of them go all the way back to Pius X, which is a long ways back. Yeah. That's a schismatic dispute within the Catholic Church. It has nothing to do with law enforcement.
No, and it certainly shouldn't.
It shouldn't.
And it should make all Catholics nervous. And if the U.S. Catholic bishops got their act together and didn't take 3 years to make any kind of statement, they would actually push back immediately. Thanks, Ed Morrissey of Hot Air. More to come on O'Connor Tonight.